Working Cows Podcast, episode 375. This episode is brought to you by C90 Ocean Minerals.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Working Cows Podcast, episode 375. This episode is brought to you by C90 Ocean Minerals.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag Studios, and this episode is brought to you by C90 Ocean Minerals. C90 Ocean Minerals, the leading mineral and trace element sea salt for your herd, is now available nationwide at Tractor Supply Company. We're excited to bring the incredible benefits of our mineral-rich sea salt to more farmers and ranchers across the country. To find your closest Tractor Supply location, visit us at c-90.com/tractor today. Trouble with flies? Select stores also carry C90 mineral salt with garlic for fly control. Learn more today at c-90.com/tractor. Very excited to be joined today by Jordan Steele. Jordan is, of course, a part of the team at Ranch Management Consultants as well as Ranch Right. And we are going to talk to Jordan today about starting entities, the different kinds of entities that exist and the different reasons why and benefits of starting different types of entities. And so really excited to talk to Jordan about this. He's put together a great outline and really excited to kind of flesh out some of this outline that he's got put together for us today. So Jordan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Clay. It's always good to be back.
Had a couple of listeners reach out recently and ask about forming, entities, LLCs, partnerships, and those kinds of things. And you kind of seem like the guy to talk to about those kinds of things. So, yeah, just tell me about a little bit how you think about that. How do you think about where in and when is right for different ranches to consider, entering into these kinds of different agreements and who are they right for and kind of what makes it ideal?
So entities, like I said, there's a handful of them. There's some pretty common ones. Then they can get as complex as you need them to be. I think entities can be great, but they can also be a pain in the butt too. So every ranch is going to be so specific on what they need and what their goals are. And as far as size and scale, and then multi-generations, and there's about 6 different factors that go into entities. So I love as far as like mindset, I love the mindset of an entity. It's kind of the first step in making us establish a business. And that's kind of that'd be like where the Ranch Profit School comes in, is like, let's see ourselves as a business. If we need to set up an entity, a legal entity, then that'd be the second step to that.
I guess then, dive into what are some of those entities, how do you choose one? What makes one more attractive for a certain kind of business than another?
Yeah, so the most common entities would be general partnerships, and that's basically just kind of get a bank account with a partner or more, and off you go. It's the most generic, easy to set up entity. The problem with a general partnership probably would be there's very, very little, in fact, no liability protection on those. You do expose yourselves to risks of the other partners in a general partnership. And then the next step would be another common one, this would be an older entity, would be a C corporation. That's what most of your big businesses are going to be. And then C corporations can elect to be an S corporation. And then that changes a little bit. They can only be so many shareholders in an S corporation. And then the taxes change a little bit. They come through to the shareholder, whereas a C corporation pays its own taxes. And then probably the most common, but possibly maybe most misunderstood, is the limited liability company, and I'll call it LLC for short. But the LLC is very common to most people, but it can actually be an S corp, a C corp, or just a single member LLC, depending on how you elect to be when you enter that one. So that seems to be the most common one. Is everyone is an LLC, but you have to dig down into your tax forms and your startup papers to know what actual kind of entity it is. So that's kind of I call it the wild card, because it can be taxed just like the other ones. And then a lot of more used in estate planning rather than business planning, but there are trusts and estates too. So they have their different purposes. But like I said, those are more commonly used for estates. They don't have the greatest business structure, and we can go into that later, kind of comparing those if you want to.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's helpful. And so we've kind of talked about some of the different types, but let's talk a little bit about why a business might want to form an entity. And I suppose kind of which one of these you're going to choose is going to be somewhat dependent on what you're hoping to accomplish with that entity.
Yep. Laying out those goals is first and foremost. So we'll just kind of let that one be to the end, because I got that one at the end. But the first one I have is liability protection. This is often the main reason most entities get set up. Unfortunately, the liability protection a lot of times just comes from coffee shop gossip. The liability protection in entities, it really depends on the entity. Like I said, the general partnership basically has no liability protection, whereas the other ones are going to be limited to your investment in the company. The biggest problem with some of our owner-operator ranches, like a common question is, if I'm driving the tractor on the highway and I get in a wreck, I could get sued and lose the ranch, right? Well, if you're the owner-operator and you operate the machinery and you're in the wrecks, if the negligence is on you, then you're still going to be the liable one. Whereas if maybe if you had a non-family employee, and then there'd be that separation there between where was the negligence or the cause at. So sometimes the liability protection is overstated. My opinion is that the meanest lawyer still wins in most court cases. So we have to get all our cards and use them properly. Because the biggest thing is there's called a corporate veil when you set up an entity. So when you have your corporate veil straight and narrow, we're paying all the personal expenses out of the personal account, and we're taking the proper amount of wages or rents or distributions out of the entity. We're truly, if someone looks at it and says, no, this is a business, there's no intermingling of money or funds or activities like that, then that's very, very important. So you got to be careful with not to pierce the corporate veil. And in all cases, honestly, if you just make sure you have your adequate liability insurance covered, sometimes you might not need the entity if you just up your liability insurance for those reasons. So liability protection is the biggest one. Like I said, that's kind of the main reason. Unfortunately, some of the facts in there aren't always conveyed properly at the coffee shop.
And we've set up 2 LLCs in the past year, and both times the lawyer has reiterated that piece about don't pierce the corporate veil, keep those funds separate, handle everything kind of the way it's designed to be, and then that liability, because when you pierce the corporate veil, as I understand it, the liability protection basically vanishes altogether, let alone, all the other caveats that you've placed on that liability protection here. So,
Yep, absolutely. They're just if you get into that case, the lawyer can just kind of jumble everything together and off they go. So no, I'm glad he's on that for you. That's good.
For sure. And then I think the other thing that we should say is that neither Jordan or I are lawyers or CPAs. We both hire lawyers and CPAs to do that work for us so that we don't go to jail when it comes time for those questions to be answered.
Yep, that's right. And I've brought that up several times, but find a good team to help you with this. And that's, with my work at Kansas Farm Management, this is where I learned most of this stuff. And I kind of took the backbone of this is a lot from Mark Dykman, who's my supervisor there. He made a pretty good outline of these differences in entities. So that's where I'm knowledgeable, but I usually tell people I just know enough to be dangerous. So that's part of our disclaimer there.
Yeah. And what's some of the other reasons to form an entity?
So business transfer. This one's my favorite. I put liability protection at the top just because it's the most common. But business transfer, I really, really like an entity because when you get that entity up and rolling, then it's profitable, it's making decisions, and you can transfer that business on. And like I said, your mindset changes when you have that business, and you're going to take wages or draws from that business for your labor and management. You're going to manage it to be profitable, and you don't to get it mixed in with your personal stuff. So that's where ranching for profit. We talk about treat your ranch as a business. What's your relationship to it? And just setting up an entity doesn't guarantee that. You have to follow through on that. So if you can do it under one entity, that's great. But it's nice to have the separation there in your mind of I'm working for this business is working for me. And then the business can also outlive the owner in that case. How common is it that we see farms and ranches, the guy gets to retirement age and then they just start selling off assets to fund their retirement or whatever else they need later in life. And so if we get a business up and rolling, the business is taking care of the debt payments, the business is taking care of owner draws for us to live on, or we can sell the whole business, and there might be better tax breaks in there for that, selling the business rather than selling individual assets. So I like the duration of an entity for a business structure like that.
Yeah, and if you're keeping business separate from personal and actually paying yourself a wage, then it's easier to see the profitability of the business when it comes time to sell it, right? I think that would help make it easier to sell.
And you can show those numbers to the whoever might be buying it, because you say, hey, I'm taking a wage out and I'm taking profit out too.
Yep.
So
there are those people out there who listen to the Working Cows podcast that don't own land or cows. I've heard of them anyways. And this is something I wish I would have known when my wife and I owned a coffee shop for 10 years. Like, a lot of the things that ranching for profit teaches are things that I wish we would have known when we were owning that coffee shop, because it would have cleared up a lot of these things, and we probably would have done more than just keep our kids out of daycare by owning the coffee shop. So
So it relates over to different industries too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Next up on the reasons why forming an LLC might be a good idea.
So the next one I have is estate planning. Estate planning, the biggest asset for most ranches is going to be the land part. So I would say kind of a common one here recently with tax laws and everything is if you have multiple children, maybe there's a land entity that can get split between all the children, but then the operating entity goes to the on-farm heir. So that makes it, they get a little bit of a benefit from staying on the ranch, but they still pay that same, they got to pay market value rent to the land entity. So all the kids are sharing in some form of a distribution. So we can kind of split the assets that way. Of course, nothing is fair in estate planning, but that is one way to do it. Right now, the current exemption is about, in rough numbers, $25 million for a married filing joint couple. That is set to sunset. This is a Trump tax law change. But right now, the current estate exemption is pretty high, so there hasn't been much pressure on the estate planning side of entities. But that could change basically with every election, like every other tax law. So we haven't had that push lately, but Same thing as we were talking about, the business can outlive the owner. With this estate planning, you can get ahead of a lot of these discussions and how do we make the ranch survive multiple generations. So,
and I think that the current projection is that sunset is going to be roughly half, right? That's going to be cut in roughly half.
Yes.
And like you said, everything's liable to change with, depending on who has a cold today or whatever. So we'll see, how that ends up. But
yep. Yeah, because the other one, they let it adjust for inflation kind of behind the scenes of this new exemption. And when the one sunsets, then wherever that one was indexed for inflation, that's where it'll be.
Sure.
So.
Gotcha. Yep. And what are some other reasons you've seen that are good for starting an LLC? Or an entity?
Tax management? Yeah, any entity. Yep. So definitely big tax savings if you set your entities up right. I'm going to go back to the business. We have to be profitable first, right? We have to do our economics first and push on profit first before we worry about income taxes. But when we're getting to a time where we're maybe having to write a $50,000 or a $70,000 check, that's going to be that could be a lot of money that we could reinvest back into ourselves rather than pay into the taxes. So there's self-employment tax savings on you can do self-land rentals, or in an S corp, when you set yourself up on wages, then the earnings are not subject to self-employment tax. So you can do some help there. I always say, we got to fill the 12% tax bracket before there's much savings, because in an S corp, this is just the example I'm using. If you set yourself up on payroll, you have to withhold FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare, and that's what self-employment tax is anyways. So it's kind of 6 one way, half a dozen the other, until you get to a point of where I'm going to take a wage out, and then the rest can be earnings. So the land rentals and we're watching how to save self-employment tax, because there's kind of a sidebar on taxes. I like to think of them as 3 different layers. There's ordinary tax, and then there's some tax that's subject to self-employment tax that creates the highest one. And then there's always capital gains, which are actually the lowest rates. So if we can kind of jump down to a different level, not necessarily a different bracket, but a different rate of tax, we can get some pretty good savings there.
Sure. And can you walk me through just a little bit the difference in S corp earnings? That's something that is beyond what we're paying in expenses through wages and things like that, or what are we talking about?
Yep, that's exactly it. So the S corp is the business, and you can take money out for wages for your labor. You could take money out for land rent. And then the S corp would also pay all the other stuff like feed and vet and fuel and repairs and other land leases and all that stuff. And then the profit down at the bottom of that would be S corp earnings, which you would be able to take some of that money out there.
So in ranching for profit lingo, S corp earnings is the same as profit. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah. In the what I'm talking about here, it would be pretty darn close.
Yep. Okay. All right.
Yep.
Carry on.
So the next one would be farm program payments. So individuals and entities only get one payment limitation. So, if you and I started an S corp together, that S corp only gets one payment limitation, and there'd be some money left on the table there. Whereas if you and I were farming separately and just shared machinery, we would get 2 payments, 1 each. So if your farm gets pretty big, that can be a pretty substantial deal. So the way around that is you can get general partnerships. So you could do a general partnership of us owning S corps. These can get very complex very quickly. So you just make sure that if you're chasing this route, you understand the complexity that it might be. I mean, there are some firms that have made their business figuring out the best entity setup for some of these large farms to get that.
Sure. And does this is this connected at all to the AGI, adjusted gross income?
Yes.
On what you can, like some of those you can't even get into the programs. Correct. If you have too high of an AGI? Is that what you're talking about here?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I think right now the payment limit's 125,000. I think
right.
That could be. It's been a couple years since I've been in that area, so it could be up now. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. So if your entity structure limited your and I's partnership by 125,000, that could be pretty substantial.
Yep.
So,
yeah. And I think, depending on where you're at, I think some of the, even if you have 12 paddocks, they're paying like $40 an acre on management intensive grazing. So it doesn't take very long to get to 120,000 if you're,
exactly,
if you're doing some of this stuff. So, Yep.
And some of those, I think the only time I really saw people max out on it was when there's a couple of those like special program payment deals. Not normally like your annual ones would most people max out on, but if there was something that came through extra, then you might miss out on some of that. But
sure. Yep.
But just like we were talking about the estate planning, those are subject to change every 4 years too. For sure. Yep. And then what else? Any other things that you think of? The last one I have is there are some fringe benefits on there. Depending on your entity, you can get, like your health insurance or retirement kind of added in as part of your compensation. The entity could pay that. Maybe housing and meals, depending on how you have everything set up. So farms and ranches have a little more leeway with the housing and meals because you can argue that we have to be out there due to weather, due to livestock, stuff like that. So some of them are partially taxable, some of them are non-taxable, depending on how the entity is set up. But there are a few fringe benefits that you can tack on there to help that entity choice make that easier.
Sure. Yep. And what are kind of some of the things that you would do to get people's mind in the right place before they start to form an entity? What are some of the things they should be thinking about there?
Two things I really look at. I'm going to kind of skip down on the outline here. The first two things I look at are the profit and the equity. And so, when I'm looking at profit, I'm looking at like business size, business scale. But then if we're consistently filling those bottom tax brackets, out of the 12% tax bracket, that's where I'm going to look at, okay, we need to look at an entity to start saving some money on taxes. The reason, and I don't think many people would disagree with me on filling the bottom tax brackets. Because if you look at the bottom tax brackets right now, they're like around that $80,000 or $90,000 mark. Well, if we're being honest about our family living, that's where most people's family living is running for, a family. We've got all have young kids. So we're at that level. We're just kind of generating enough money to put food on the table and enjoy life. Mm-hmm. Once we get up into those middle tax brackets, then we're going to start let's look at some after-tax wealth. And, we're going to pay some taxes, we're going to manage them, but let's talk about after-tax wealth, not just get enough money to run the house. So, and then the next one I look at is equity and what's your net worth. If there's a lot of land in there, we know land generally increases over time. And I kind of compare that to the estate tax limits. Like I said, we've got that super high exemption amount right now. So that one hasn't been as big of a problem. But if we kind of gauge those two areas, that's where we're looking at, so someone young like us, if you just own a quarter or two of land, probably pretty highly leveraged, it might not be the best time for an entity because the added paperwork and added fees, because every return is going to be another tax prep fee, another this, another that, is not going to be worth the savings until we get to some certain size. And you're never going to be able to tell that without looking at all those different questions.
Right. Yep. And I think, kind of back to that whole first things first deal, right? We want to make sure that we're profitable, make sure that we're generating that profit. And then maybe it's going to be worth it to look at forming one of these entities, and that's kind of what I hear you saying, basically.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. So, other things that we want to think about, other considerations before forming an entity. What are some of the things you're thinking about there?
So the big one, I'm going to go back to that team. I said consult qualified legal counsel with ag experience. LegalZoom.com is not going to know what your ranch needs. It's going to be some sort of boilerplate terminology in there. I say work with good legal counsel. work with your accountant too, and then really anyone else on your team. So I threw in your lender and your insurance agent too. So that's kind of who I think of when I think of a professional team, get their opinions, get their ideas on it. As a tax preparer, it is a nightmare when someone comes to you and they're like, "Oh yeah, I set up an LLC this year. Can you file the taxes for that?" And it's like, okay, we got to back up a little bit, but we can take care of it. But let's get backed up and get started right here. So I always tell people to get a second opinion too. We say talk with others, so it's easier to look over the fence. But there are times when I'm in your business and I'm not going to see something else too. So if you go find someone else and say, "Hey, well maybe this," like, yeah, that's a really good idea. So find someone qualified to talk about it first, and then get a second opinion, and then make the best decision for yourself too. So because your operating agreement. We got to put an operating agreement in there with contingencies. We got to talk about buy-sell agreements if there's going to be multiple partners. And then the biggest one is, the 5 Ds, right? Remember, death, divorce, disagreement, all those. We can go on and on and on down the list. But when something happens to a partner, what happens with those shares, or what happens with those management decisions? So the more we think about that, and the more we put that down on paper in an operating agreement, will really help in the future.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's helpful. I think that a lot of times, starting with the end in mind, what are you hoping to accomplish? Yes. What is your goal? What are you wanting this to do? Are you wanting this to be a tool, a vehicle for passing the business on to the next generation? Then that's probably going to affect the way that these things get formed from the outset.
Yep, absolutely. And you said passing it down to the next generation. I said coordinate with estate planning here too.
Right.
So we've got that in there.
Yeah, and that team, we've talked about that a few different times. Can you talk to me about some of the people that you think are on that team? I mean, lawyer, CPA, financial advisor, some of those others that you would think of, insurance agents, bankers, anything else that I'm missing there? I
think you got the main group there. Yep, definitely. I think those are the ones I think of. If there's a group of 4 or 5 trusted, I think that's where you need to be at.
Yeah, and financial advisor is not the same as bookkeeper or CPA, right? Those Correct. Are different roles.
And so, that's exactly right. So
make sure you got them all covered, I guess, for sure. So other things that you want to do, some kind of this checkbox of, we've got these things checked off. Now it's time to form an entity. What are some of the other things in the before forming an entity bucket here?
So the 2 I think that we haven't covered before would be, we just need to know what assets and liabilities are going into the entity. So if we're setting up a landowning LLC or something, they're going to need deeds and legal descriptions and all that stuff. And then also those mortgages that are with that are going to need to be tied in there together too. So we just need to verify assets and liabilities. Depending on the entity, you got to be careful of a taxable event. So anytime you shift debt around, you got to be careful that doesn't trigger a taxable event. Now there's no cash changes hands, but it's possible that could be taxable. So just got to be careful with that. Your tax preparer will be well equipped to deal with that, or tell you how to approach it right. Depending on what time of the year we're going to do this, we could always start an entity now. It's July 1st, so that would kind of make sense for some things. But you got to be careful of your cash flows in there with, depending if you start on the calendar year or a mid-year startup. A lot of if the ranch carries over calves, well, as the calves were produced by the individual, but do they get sold in the entity, or does the individual sell the calves and then inject the money in there? So you kind of got to be careful of those startup problems, and those are going to be, no matter when or what you do, you're going to have those issues. So just have a conversation about how that money flows.
Yep.
And assets.
Yep. And we've started a couple LLCs in the last year, and had started one before that for a family business, and went the LegalZoom route on the one before. That was not good. And went the, hometown lawyer in the town with a sale barn and, surrounded by agricultural land. And I was kind of surprised that the cost really wasn't that much different. It was more locally, which I'm always happy to pay more locally. But, and I felt like, as you said, we got a better product in the end that was actually what we needed, not just some boilerplate, something spit out, by the computer or whatever. The names are changed to protect the innocent kind of a deal, but the same as everybody else's. So yeah, I think that from my own experience, I'm just echoing what you've already said for sure.
Cool. Yeah. And those standard templates, that you can get online, those contingencies, those aren't going to be in there, so in the, maybe if the ranch gets passed down and you want buy-sell agreements to be offered in a first right of refusal to siblings only, right? Those contingencies aren't going to be in there. So, and we all know that the clearer these things are at the start, the better it is, because when families are grieving, that's not when we make our best decisions. So to have that laid out beforehand is good.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, C90 Ocean Minerals. C90 Ocean Minerals, the leading mineral and trace element sea salt for your herd, is now available nationwide at Tractor Supply Company. We're excited to bring the incredible benefits of our mineral-rich sea salt to more farmers and ranchers across the country. To find your closest Tractor Supply location, visit us at c-90.com/tractor today. Trouble with flies? Select stores also carry C90 mineral salt with garlic for fly control. Learn more today at c-90.com/tractor. We've covered a little bit of the entity types. Is there something more that you want to say there?
Just kind of hit the high points, general partnership, that's a tax form 1065. Those are pass-through entities. They're the least formal. I do want to bring up C corporations. So those are be the, I guess, most formal entity. They do pay their own taxes. Right now, that flat rate is 21%. So right now, there's not a lot of encouragement to set up a C corp, because if we're paying 10 and 12 and then 22 at our individual rate, the C corp is already higher for those. So when C corps were 15%, we could get some fringe benefits out of them. We could get other deals, and then we could split our lower tax brackets. But this last tax law has changed that one a little bit. And then the S corp, that one's elected after the C. It's also a pass-through entity. You got to be careful with C and S corporations, because you are required to have a board of directors and annual meetings. So when you need to have minutes and everything, and that's all about that corporate veil too. So if you do find yourself in a lawsuit, if you have your articles of incorporation and show your annual meetings and what is discussed about, and show the minutes to the lawyers or whoever's involved, that will show, yes, this is an arm's length transaction. So
sure.
One more thing on S corporations, though. You really have to watch your basis in those entities. They work well when you're profitable, but when an S corporation is not profitable, you lose what you call basis in it. And I've seen cases where the S corporation is losing money, but we're still paying a pretty big amount of income taxes because we can't deduct those losses. So you got to be careful of that issue there.
Have we kind of covered the limited liability company?
I think so, because the biggest thing with LLCs is just that it could be a single member that just gets reported alongside with your social security number, or could be multi-member but elects to be a corporation. So you never really know what entity an LLC is. They default to partnership, so most of them are that, but there is a chance that it's not. So a lot of people lately, I've seen a lot of people go a limited liability company elected as an S corp. So you get the liability protection, you get the tax savings of an S corp, but an LLC doesn't have to do some of the board meeting requirements and stuff like that. So you can be a little more lax on the kind of the business operating, I guess, like that. So most of those entities too, you do have to do some sort of state Secretary of State requirement. Most states, it's just kind of an annual fee, send in the report, hey, I'm still using this business. To me, that's really all it is.
Yep.
But yeah.
Yep, for sure. That is at least true in South Dakota.
Is it? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of how it works. Any others here as far as types of entities that you wanted to cover? Anything that you're thinking of as far as things that are important for people to think about or options that they might consider?
Just bring up trusts. Those are called fiduciaries. So that's an income tax 1041. So there's a little bit of difference between estates and trusts. Like I said, most common for like generation planning stuff. Technically, estates should only file a couple years of tax returns before the assets get distributed. But trusts, I wanted to bring this up. Trusts can be revocable or irrevocable. And now most people you'll hear say, I set up a trust, so I have this stuff. Depending on the trust, a revocable trust is more or less your shadow. It just kind of exists in the background until you pass away. And then that trust becomes its entity, and then that trust will take care of the assets. An irrevocable trust is a separate entity, and you actually relinquish, give away all your assets to that trust. And it will have its own tax filing and stuff like that. So trusts are a little bit of a hybrid with the income taxes because they can pay the tax or they can distribute the money and then have the individual downstream pay the income tax on it. I did work with, I have seen a couple that they left it as the operating business. The problem is there's higher tax rates in the trust side than on the individual side. So just got to be careful of what rates you're at there.
Sure. And as far as the irrevocable trust, this is a separate entity. Assets are relinquished to that while the person is still living. That's kind of the difference. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
And do you think that there's one that's better than another for agriculture specifically, or is it kind of just your preference, whatever you want?
For the trusts?
Yes.
I think it's individual. Definitely gotta. There's a lot of revocable trusts around, and so those are pretty common. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I did want to bring up basis. With an irrevocable trust, if you give away something, that maintains the basis in it. Since I went there, I'll just go there. But right now, the current law is when someone passes away, all of their assets get what they call a step up in basis. And then the heirs get that at market value. So, if grandpa paid $100 an acre for the land and the ranch is worth $1 million now, there's a big taxable gain in there, right? Well, if you do that, if you put that into an irrevocable trust, that basis sticks with it. If you let the land, the only way to get out of taxes is to die, right? So there's tax planning in that, but then your heirs get that step up in basis, and that's a really big deal. So I would guess that's why most would not go down an irrevocable trust right now.
I see. So the revocable trust helps mitigate that stepped up basis.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, because the revocable trust doesn't go into effect until you die. So the land would get stepped up in basis and then go into the trust.
I see. And is there somewhere along the line somebody's paying the tax on that stepped up or on the step up basis? Is that right?
Yeah, not until they sell it. So, in that example, the heirs could sell it the next day tax free because there wouldn't be much appreciation in a day. So that's a big deal.
Yeah,
the step up basis, and that's usually in Congress every 4 years too, and that's a big deal. Huh. It's a big deal for agriculture, but it's a big deal for all small family businesses, actually.
Right. Yeah, and I know it's maybe not popular, and don't hold Jordan or any of the entities he's affiliated with responsible for what I'm about to say, but this is the reason why organizations like Farm Bureau and other organizations exist, right, is to give a united voice. Whether they get a lot of other things right or wrong, they give a united voice to farmers and ranchers to fight against things like this that can really change our ability to pass on assets that people have put blood, sweat, and tears into. So I think that, that's what they're doing is trying to make sure that those, that there are options to make sure that a step up in basis does not end up causing us to have to dissolve assets to, pay taxes. Those are just my 2 cents.
Yep. Nope. That's a great point.
So, okay. So we've talked about, the different types of entities, why you might want to form one, kind of the mindset that we want to have before we go into forming one. Let's talk about kind of the process. What do we do to form an entity? What are some of those things?
So once you get your, like I said, you're just going to get your leadership team together, decide on that entity type, and you're going to decide on the type and then when to start it. We talked about those mid-year or first a year, calendar year type starting. And then you're going to get the EIN from the IRS, and you can actually just do that online. If you have a lawyer setting everything up, I would recommend them doing it because then they make sure all the spelling's right, all the commas, abbreviations, whatever is needed. And then that EIN is going to come on what's called an SS4, and that's going to give you your first tax return date too. So that's going to be when, the IRS, if I were to do an EIN submit for one now, it'd be, okay, Jordan and Clay's Ranch LLC first tax return is going to do March 15th, 2025, right? So the IRS is then going to be looking for that tax return, kind of gets you on the track to get your e-files and everything, right?
Sure.
And that's for federal. And then remember, you got to do your Secretary of State papers as needed. You're going to do some annual reports, probably upload some articles of incorporation or something to the state, wherever you're at. And then you need to set up your board of directors. And I put in there, get your annual meeting scheduled for your minutes and everything. Then I just put also with annual meetings, that's kind of what's required with entities, but I put more in there because we're back to the business part of it. Big businesses are going to meet more than once a year, so
Yep. And those are again limited to the S and C corps, right? Pretty much.
Yep. It's going to be different based on the entities.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you're going to have to get a new bank account, separate bank account specific to that entity. There's kind of a catch-22 here on the bank accounts because a lot of banks will require the EIN to be with that. If you set up a business account, not just a personal account, doing business as or something. But I've helped a few people in the past where it's kind of the chicken and the egg situation. It's like we don't want the entity to start until next year, so we need to wait until January 1st to get the EIN. So then we don't have to file a tax return this year. So there's a little bit of a waiting game there, or else you just have to be real careful and keep track of your cash records right away to get what needs to be technically contributed into that to get that started up right.
Yeah. And I don't know if things have changed or I misunderstood the process, but I know that the opening a business checking account with a DBA is not as easy as it used to be, I don't think. I think a lot more, at least the banks I've been dealing with recently, really want that LLC kind of to be up and running, and then they'll help you start that business checking account a little bit easier, it seems like to me.
Yeah. And I think this is a 1 or 2 year process. I just put in here, have patience and start out correctly, because it's much easier to plan this out and do it right next year than do it now and have to undo a bunch of things that we need to transfer back in or out. So that's I've started out with some really, really good entities, and man, we just continue to fight some of the other ones. So.
Sure. And I think that, as I understand it, some of this is a little bit flexible as far as what kind of entity you're going to be after formation. You have some period of time to decide, are we going to be an S Corp, a C Corp, some of those things. Am I right in that?
Yeah, and so there's different elections in there, So I mean, if you want to get something going, so you have that business mindset, you can start up a single member LLC and operate that for a little while, and then you can elect to change entity type. So there are elections that you can switch back and forth in that LLC framework. That's actually pretty simple. I haven't had to do one of those, but I know we can get on the IRS website and just elect to do that. So.
Sure.
So yes, there is flexibility.
Yep. Yeah, very good. Appreciate, kind of the way we worked through this today. But what are some of the, final thoughts, things that you'd say kind of as we point towards wrapping up here?
Sure. The biggest thing I noticed is, our current laws and regulations have a big impact on our recommendations. Right now, it would be really easy to say, put your land in an LLC, gives you flexibility. You have the SE tax savings, and limited liability companies. Those partnerships do have the ability for a step up in basis, whereas a corporation, does the underlying asset get the step up in basis, or if it's a corporation, does the stock get a basis, right? Does the company own the land? So it'd be easy to suggest that. It'd be easy to suggest an operating S corp. But there's a lot of old C corporations around that ranches set up in the 60s, 70s. I think it was like 85 somewhere that they did a big tax law change, and that tax law changed the C corps. And so now there's a lot of old ranches as C corporations that are really stuck in some pretty hard C corp tax traps, because remember, with the dividends and stuff in a C corp, there is a kind of a double tax rate on those, and so those are hard. I mean, those entities are stuck forever. So I just say, what we recommend now, it's going to change. So we make the best decisions with the information we have at hand, but we need to be aware of our future generations are going to be using these too.
Do you think that those old C corps with land in them stuck in tax traps, do you think that is the result of somebody not paying attention to changes that were coming, or is it a failure of lobbying to not let that happen, or is it maybe some combination of the two?
It's probably a combination of the two. That's a really good question. I've never really thought of it because I just kind of looked at them at face value. It is what it is, but there's some of them that you look back and they were the thing to do. They made it. Who knows? Maybe they saved enough money to make it worth now. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question.
Yeah, you weren't reading those headlines when you were 4 or 5 years old when all that changed or whatever.
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but I do think that generally there's at least some warning that these changes are coming, and you've got an opportunity to change a corporation. And I think that kind of speaks to kind of the mindset of having a corporation, right? Like, if you're just going to let it sit there and it's not actually going to inform the way that you make decisions on a day-to-day basis or even on a quarterly basis in your business, then maybe the entity isn't the right thing. But if it's going to help you decide how you do business on some level, then maybe the entity is there and is helpful. Whereas if it's just kind of sitting, it's in the closet, and sometimes we dust it off and look at it, but then, we forgot to look at it when this big regulation change happens and now we're stuck. Maybe that's kind of one of those things that we want to a little more regularly pay attention to what's going on with the entity types and the way that they are taxed. Would you agree with that?
Yep, you nailed it. I think, just to sum it up, yeah, when they're used right, they're fantastic. Taxes are easier, record keeping's good, decisions are good, but if they're used and misused and abused, then they can sure be a nightmare for everyone involved.
Yeah, yep, for sure. Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to this accountability piece, right? You got to be willing to pay attention and learn and look at what's going on with them if you're going to keep doing it. Anything else you'd say on that?
Last thing I'd say is if we're looking at some big entity setups and for tax savings and estate planning, I would say it might be expensive to get these things going, but it darn sure might be worth it too, because someone at one of our ranch profit schools, these are the numbers he said, but yeah, $50,000 is expensive, but what is it worth to save the $10 million ranch? So that was a good thought on, we're always trying to be cognizant of costs, but sometimes that's money well spent too.
Right. Yep. And what's the ranching for profit adage, right? You can't starve profit into a business, and
yes, that's exactly right.
The war on costs is okay as far as it goes, but sometimes you got to spend some money to be able to protect what you have, or spend some money to make some money. It's an investment at some point. So, yeah. Well, Jordan, I appreciate you putting the effort into putting this outline together. Very thorough. Thank you for going through it with me. Anything that's exciting coming up, or anything you want to plug? This should be out here middle of July.
And so we had a pretty busy month with one school and 2 young rancher schools, and then KLR marketing for us too. So that was a lot of fun. And then we're starting to get our fall schools. And our fall schools are up on the website, and our winter schools are not all of them are up. Once we finalize hotel details and dates, we'll get those on the website. So we're just kind of enjoying our slow time at the moment and getting ready for another season.
Very good. Well, Jordan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Clay. I was happy to be here.
Very good stuff there with Jordan. As always, appreciate him and his ability to articulate some of these things and his experience and the level of experience that he brings to some of these discussions. Coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to be talking to Greg Christensen. Greg has been a guest before on the podcast, and we're going to talk to him this time about the kind of the ins and outs of implementing small ruminants, which is similar to what we talked about last time, but we're going to talk to him more in depth and about a school that they have coming up about the grazing school, and it'll be cows and small ruminants, goats, hair sheep, those kinds of things at this school that they've got coming up as well. So taking a little bit of a different approach and a deep dive looking at the small ruminant side of the industry. So we'll see you again real soon with another episode of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.